Welcome to the debate. Imagine an employee in your finance department quietly building a digital clone of themselves over the weekend, to do their job entirely off the grid. Sounds like science fiction, right? Well, in 2026, that is just a Tuesday.
It really is. And honestly, it's probably the reason that specific finance employee gets to go home at 5 p.m. instead of midnight.
Perhaps, but it is also the reason the enterprise landscape is currently sitting on a powder keg. We have undeniably crossed the Rubicon here, from just experimentation into structural deployment.
Yeah, the scale has completely shifted.
Exactly. Today, 76% of public companies are using AI in some operational capacity, and 59% are investing over $1 million annually. We aren't just talking about chatbots that help you draft a polite email anymore. We have moved into the era of agentic AI.
Right. And for anyone listening who might still be anchored to the 2023 ChatGPT era, agentic AI means we are dealing with systems that act autonomously.
Completely on their own.
Yeah, these are agents that don't just generate text. They execute multi-step workflows, they negotiate basic vendor contracts, they reconcile accounts, they query databases on their own. We are literally talking about deploying non-human labor at scale.
We are. The stakes have fundamentally changed. Which brings us to the core tension we are unpacking today. As companies attempt to scale this non-human labor beyond the pilot phase, what is the most effective implementation strategy?
Should organizations rely on a disciplined, top-down, centralized approach or a ground-up, democratized strategy driven by the end users?
Leadership-driven strategy is essential to overcome massive failure rates, ensure data readiness, and govern risk.
And I represent the position that a ground-up, employee-driven approach is the only way to foster genuine innovation, prevent workforce sabotage, and leverage the true power of democratized agentic AI.
So let me start by diagnosing why I think we are in an execution crisis right now, one that only executive discipline can really fix. The failure rates for enterprise AI are just staggering.
They are definitely high, yeah.
High is an understatement. According to RAND Corporation and recent MIT data, between 70 and 90% of enterprise AI projects are failing. And BCG reports that 74% of companies show zero tangible value from their investments. You have to ask why that is happening.
Well, I'd argue it's because of the very top-down structure you're advocating for.
Look, I see why you'd say that, but the data points to a structural mechanism here, and that is integration. Let's look at why 42% of companies abandon most of their AI initiatives by mid-2025. It is precisely because of crowdsourced, ground-up efforts.
Wait, how do you figure that?
Well, say a marketing team builds a brilliant agent to generate copy, or, a logistics team builds a predictive supply chain tool. It works beautifully on the laptop, but because it was built in a silo, the moment they try to plug it into the central ERP system or scale it across thousands of employees, it hits an integration wall and shatters.
Okay, but just let me finish the thought.
You end up with highly localized optimization, but a totally fragmented enterprise. This is why I align with PwC's perspective. They call it the disciplined march to value.
The discipline march.
Right. Yeah, you need senior leadership to look at the entire organization, pick 3 or 4 high-value workflows, and execute them through a centralized AI studio that strictly links business goals to AI capabilities. You just cannot build a unified enterprise architecture from the bottom up.
Okay, let's unpack that discipline march to value, because I have some thoughts. The reason those failure rates are so astronomically high isn't because we lack an AI studio or executive control. It is because those top-down strategies are entirely disconnected from the actual work being done.
Disconnected how? The executives are the ones setting the goals?
Setting goals is not the same as understanding the friction. Look at the recent writers' survey data. 75% of executives admit their company's AI strategy is more for show than actual guidance.
More for show?
Yes, it is performative. It's an executive buying a massive enterprise license so they have a glossy slide for the next board meeting.
Calling it performative feels like a bit of a dismissal of the very real architectural planning required too.
But it is performative if it doesn't help the worker. The most transformative value in 2026 isn't coming from IT, it's coming from putting agent building power directly into the hands of the people closest to the workflows.
You mean the power users?
Exactly. What the data calls the AI elite or super users, these are individual employees who took the initiative. They are already 5 times more productive than their peers, saving an average of 9 hours a week.
9 hours is significant, sure.
It's massive. And what are they doing with those 9 hours? They are doing deep, strategic work. If you force them to wait for a centralized AI studio to approve and build their tools, you absolutely kill that innovation.
Okay, you bring up these super users moving fast and building their own tools like it's some kind of utopia. But moving fast off the grid is exactly what terrifies me when we look at governance. And this is really where the rubber meets the road.
Oh, I knew we'd get the governance.
We have to. In 2026, the EU AI Act is fully enforceable. We have strict, punitive regulations tightening globally. Governance cannot just be a checklist anymore. It has to be a dynamic, enterprise-wide security layer.
Security is important, yes, but
It's existential, honestly. The massive liability right now is shadow AI. This goes back to my opening example of the rogue finance clone. When employees bring in unvetted tools or build their own rogue agents to process company data, the risk surface just explodes.
they're just trying to get their jobs done.
Due to unapproved AI tools. And terrifyingly, 35% admit they couldn't immediately pull the plug on a rogue agent if it went off the rails.
35%, wow.
Yeah, letting employees build and deploy their own AI agents to manipulate enterprise data is like letting every employee write their own compliance laws. It is a recipe for a catastrophic breach.
Okay, that compliance law analogy is a powerful image, I'll give you that. But I really think it mischaracterizes how the technology actually functions today. Have you considered that locking AI inside IT actually creates the very shadow AI you are trying to prevent?
Wait, how does centralized security create shadow AI? That doesn't make sense.
Because of bottlenecks. Employees still have a job to do. Their KPIs haven't changed. In fact, they've probably increased. So if the centralized AI studio tells a marketing manager, hey, great idea for a competitive analysis agent, we'll provision that for you in 6 months.
They aren't going to wait 6 months.
Exactly. That manager isn't going to wait. They are going to find a workaround, especially now because we are squarely in the era of vibe coding.
Okay, let's actually explain vibe coding for the audience, because it sounds like a tech buzzword, but it represents a massive shift.
It really does. Vibe coding means an employee doesn't need to know Python or understand system architecture anymore. They use an AI native development platform and they just talk to it in plain English.
Right, natural language programming.
Yeah. They say, hey, I need a micro app that scrapes these 5 competitor websites every morning, cross-references it with our pricing sheet, and alerts me if we are being undercut. And the system just spins it up on the fly. The barrier to entry has completely collapsed.
I agree, the barrier is gone, which is the scary part.
But my point is, suppressing that individual initiative in the name of security doesn't eliminate the risk. It just drives that innovation underground where IT has absolutely zero visibility. You can't secure what you can't see.
Okay, I agree, you can't secure what you can't see. But what happens when that vibe-coded micro app breaks? Or, what happens when that marketing manager leaves the company and IT discovers a black box agent pinging the pricing database 10,000 times a minute and no one knows how to turn it off? That is exactly why 35% of executives are terrified they can't pull the plug.
I hear that, but the solution isn't to lock the doors and ban vibe coding. The solution is to provide an open framework like a sandbox where users can safely build what they actually need with IT's blessing.
But an open framework requires an underlying data architecture that the end users simply cannot build. You cannot crowdsource data architecture. And frankly, this leads us directly into why there is such a massive disconnect with ROI.
How so?
Let's look at the MIT, NANDA, and RAND findings again. They found that AI fails primarily due to organizational issues, specifically what they call misunderstood problem definition.
Meaning, we are solving the wrong problems.
Exactly. A ground-up approach lacks rigorous business cases. A marketing manager building an agent to do competitive analysis is localized optimization. It creates a slightly faster marketing manager. But true enterprise ROI, like reducing overall manual processing by 40% across an entire division, that only happens when leadership applies the 10-20-70 rule.
Oh, the 10-20-70 rule. which is a really heavy lift.
It is, but it's the only proven method. The rule means you allocate 10% of your effort to the algorithms, 20% to the technology infrastructure, and a massive 70% to people and processes.
Right, the human element.
Exactly. You are completely redesigning how the business operates. You are rewriting job descriptions, changing reporting lines, altering incentive structures. A frontline worker cannot unilaterally redesign the workflow of 3 adjacent departments. That level of operational redesign fundamentally requires an executive mandate.
Look, I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the executive mandate is the magic bullet here.
Why not? The data supports structural change.
Because those mandates you're praising, they are exactly why 95% of enterprise generative AI pilots fail to deliver a profit.
Wait, 95% is a damning number, I admit. But I'd argue it's because the mandates aren't rigorous enough, not that they are inherently flawed.
No, it's because leadership consistently buys tools based on hype rather than actual user friction. They sign massive contracts for monolithic AI platforms because, again, it looks visionary to the board.
It's not always just for the board.
But then they take this pristine, expensive technology and force it onto fundamentally broken workflows. Only 29% of organizations are seeing significant ROI from generative AI.
Because the workflows are messy.
Because the executives in the C-suite don't understand the minutiae of the daily operations. They don't know that the procurement team spends 3 hours manually re-entering data because 2 legacy systems don't talk to each other.
So you're saying that a ground truth is lost in translation?
Yes, exactly. The employees on the ground know the workflows intimately. They know exactly where the friction is. They should be the ones dictating the technology requirements, not the other way around.
Okay, I see your point.
When an executive mandates a top-down AI deployment without understanding that ground truth, the AI simply accelerates existing inefficiencies. You just do the wrong thing faster. The 70% in your 10-20-70 rule, the people and process part, it only succeeds if the people actually executing the processes are driving the change.
That's a fair challenge, though. I would definitely reframe it. The reason we need executive mandates isn't just to blindly buy software. It's to orchestrate a massive, necessary workforce transition. We are talking about macroeconomic shifts here.
It's huge, yeah. BCG data indicates that 50 to 55% of U.S. jobs will be reshaped by AI in the next 3 years, half the workforce. It's basically an industrial revolution compressed into 36 months.
Exactly. And a change of that magnitude cannot happen organically from the bottom up. It requires deliberate, top-down transition planning. It requires enterprise-wide reskilling programs.
Sure, training is necessary.
And it requires the deployment of specialized integration talent, what the industry is calling forward-deployed engineers, who sit between the AI models and the business logic to ensure things scale safely. If you leave this to a ground-up process, you create a chaotic, 2-tiered workplace.
Wait, a 2-tiered workplace? What do you mean by that?
I mean, you end up with a small fraction of AI elites who figure it out, build their vibe-coded tools, and hoard all the productivity gains. And beneath them, a massive underclass of laggards who are left behind because the company never structurally trained them.
That assumes people won't share their tools, which I disagree with.
But beyond just training, I have to push back on your fundamental premise regarding employee autonomy. How can a ground-up approach possibly handle enterprise-wide data unification?
What do you mean, like data silos?
Yes. The reality is that 63% of organizations are unsure if they even have the right data management practices. You simply cannot build reliable AI on fragmented, siloed data.
Well, data hygiene is always an issue.
Right, but if the HR data lake isn't talking to the finance data lake, your agent is hallucinating based on incomplete context. Unifying that data, cleaning it, and structuring it requires a top-down architectural overhaul. An employee with a great idea can't fix a broken data pipeline.
Look, you're touching on data architecture, which is a completely fair technical point. You absolutely need clean data. But I think you are drastically underestimating the cultural toxicity of top-down mandates.
Toxicity is a strong word.
It's the right word. When you enforce this massive, deliberate restructuring from the top, you know what actually happens on the ground?
Pushback, certainly. Change management is always hard.
It is way beyond normal pushback. The Writers' Survey gives us a genuinely chilling look into the reality of the 2026 workplace. 29% of employees admit to actively sabotaging their company's AI strategy.
Wait, sabotaging?
Like intentionally?
Yes. And among Gen Z, that number jumps to 44%.
That is, wow. But let's clarify what sabotage means in this context, because we aren't talking about, smashing servers with a hammer.
Right, it's insidious. It means feeding the model garbage data. It means intentionally ignoring the AI's outputs and reverting to manual spreadsheets just to prove the new multi-million-dollar system is useless.
Oh, wow.
It means refusing to log interactions. And why are they doing this? Because 60% of companies are planning layoffs for non-adopters. When your top-down strategy relies on threats, job insecurity, and executive performance art, employee sabotage isn't just likely, it is a completely rational response.
I guess you could argue it is a self-preservation mechanism.
Exactly. You cannot force-feed transformation. True transformation happens through transparency. It happens by involving users early in the design process, showing them how the tool makes their specific life easier, and celebrating quick, user-driven wins.
Okay, but
If you don't empower the workforce, they will literally dismantle your enterprise architecture from the inside out.
look, I understand the fear that drives that behavior. I really do. But I am not convinced by that line of reasoning because you are conflating poor change management with the inherent necessity of top-down structure.
How is threatening 60% of the workforce with layoffs just poor change management? It's the core of the top-down playbook right now.
No, it's the core of a bad top-down playbook. Yes, threatening employees is a terrible strategy, but the existence of bad management doesn't invalidate the need for centralized governance.
I still think the governance stifles them.
Sabotage is a risk mitigated by clear communication and comprehensive reskilling, not by abdicating architectural responsibility to the workforce. Let's look at the actual mechanics of these agentic workflows we are deploying in 2026.
Okay, let's look at them.
An AI agent today isn't just fetching a document. Say we have an agent managing a supply chain disruption. That agent is analyzing the logistics delay, it is drafting communications to the affected vendors, it is actively updating the ERP system to reflect new inventory, and it is automatically adjusting the quarterly financial forecasts.
Right, so it's touching 4 different departments.
Precisely. It crosses procurement, legal, operations, and finance. An individual employee in procurement, no matter how much autonomy you give them, cannot safely optimize a workflow that impacts finance and legal simultaneously.
Because they don't see the whole picture.
Exactly. They don't have the visibility or the authority. It inherently requires an enterprise-wide control plane to catch silent failures before an automated mistake hits the P&L.
I absolutely agree that cross-departmental workflows are complex. But the idea that a centralized IT team can perfectly map, anticipate, and automate every nuance of those interactions from a boardroom, that is a fallacy. It is the illusion of control.
Well, the alternative is letting employees blindly trigger financial updates.
No, the alternative is collaborative orchestration. When you look at the companies that are actually achieving that 5x productivity gain, they aren't relying on IT to build every automation in a vacuum.
What are they doing then?
They are cultivating an environment where business analysts and frontline workers have the tools to construct what they need. Those super users aren't hoarding productivity out of malice. They are moving fast because they finally have a way to bypass the legacy IT bottlenecks that have held them back for a decade.
But bypassing IT is exactly the problem.
If you try to force them back into a rigid, top-down approval matrix, you kill the very agility that AI is supposed to provide in the first place. You mentioned the 10-20-70 rule earlier, right?
I did. The idea that 70% of the effort is people and processes.
Right, and I completely agree with that statistic. But your assumption is that the 70% must be driven by an executive mandate. I am arguing that the 70% only succeeds when it is driven by the people actually executing the processes. If they don't own the change, they will reject the change.
Well, we are certainly approaching the crux of the issue here. Both of us recognize that the status quo, what the industry calls pilot purgatory, is completely unsustainable.
Totally unsustainable, yeah.
As we look to summarize our positions on this incredibly complex landscape, I maintain that without top-down data architecture, centralized governance, and executive discipline, AI implementations will just continue to crash against the rocks of fragmented data.
Even with the risk of sabotage?
Yes, because the evidence is overwhelming that AI models are only as good as the governed data they ingest. You simply cannot crowdsource data sovereignty. You cannot crowdsource compliance with the EU AI Act.
Transformation at this scale requires a unified blueprint.
And I reiterate that without ground-up autonomy, those blueprints are just paper. AI strategies remain disconnected from the actual work, performative, and profoundly vulnerable to deep workforce resistance.
Which leads to the sabotage we talked about.
Exactly. If executives continue to treat AI as a top-down hammer to force productivity while ignoring the friction points of the people actually doing the work, they will continue to see 95% of their initiatives fail to deliver profit. True ROI comes from empowering the edges of the organization, not centralizing power at the top.
Despite our stark differences in approach and the obvious tension between security and innovation, I think there is a point of convergence we are both dancing around here.
Oh, which is what?
We both ultimately recognize the need for a hybrid, what the industry is calling an orchestration layer or a true enterprise AI platform.
Oh yes, it's kind of like an app store for the enterprise.
Exactly. It seems we are moving toward a system that provides the centralized data security, the unified metadata, and the strict compliance oversight that I am demanding, the underlying operating system.
Right.
But simultaneously, it gives the business teams the autonomous, drag-and-drop vibe coding power that you are championing.
I think that's a fantastic synthesis, honestly. IT builds the secure phone, but the employees get to choose and customize the apps they put on it.
That's a great way to put it.
It's a robust control plane managed by IT, but an execution layer democratized to the workforce. It's about building a trusted ecosystem where human creativity directs autonomous efficiency rather than forcing a rigid hierarchy onto a dynamic technology.
Reflecting on this, the sheer complexity of integrating non-human labor into the enterprise in 2026 is truly staggering. If you think about it, we are fundamentally rewriting the social contract of the workplace and the technical architecture of the corporation at the exact same time.
We really are. It is easily the defining business challenge of our decade. If you're listening to this and you lead a team, you're probably feeling this exact friction every single day. We are no longer just adopting software, we are onboarding a digital workforce.
Indeed, we are. The source material we've referenced today holds even more insights into how specific industries are navigating this exact tension. But we will leave it to the listener to decide whether the path to true AI transformation is paved by executive discipline or the collective ingenuity of the workforce.
It's a big question.
It is. When you look at the enterprise in 2026, you have to ask yourself, are we building a skyscraper with the rigid, top-down blueprint, or are we cultivating an organic, living city? The answer will likely define the winners and losers of the next decade.